Hello and welcome to Dice Tabletop. My name is Chris, and in this episode we are finally getting started with the Battle Games in Middle-earth Lord of the Rings magazine series that started in around about 2002. The original plan for this was I was going to do sort of paint one model or make one terrain per X number of series of magazines. But as I was going through and starting this, I thought that's not going to be any fun. You're going to want to see every single model from every single magazine. So I am going to mix this up, and I know I said I didn't do it, but I am going to do it. We are going to paint every single model. The plan I've got in my head of this is we're going to split it up and do 5 magazines at a time, and I think sort of every 15 episodes or so I'll throw in a piece of terrain because they're going to be bigger projects to do. Of course there are a couple of magazines that are going to be missing throughout this, but I do have the PDF versions of these as well, so we're going to be able to slip those in and we're not going to miss a single episode here. I'm going to go through each magazine quickly, one by one, so let's quickly get into the first one. These always followed a loose guide split out into a contents section, so starting off here we're finding out a little bit all about Middle-earth itself. This being the first episode, perfect introduction. If you didn't know enough about Lord of the Rings, this is really going to give you a good little introduction into it. We're going to be going over the quest of the Fellowship itself here, the story of Aragorn, and how he sort of progresses on to become the heir of the King of Gondor. From there we then start to learn about playing the game. This is split over quite a few magazines, and so we're going to be getting little tidbits as we go along, building up our knowledge of how to play the game. It's also got some little scenarios in there as well, and over the course of the magazine you learn to play all of the big events that happen. Next from there, it's all about making the model that it came with. This one came specifically with goblins, so that's what we're going to be starting off with here. How to trim the model, how to get the flash lines off, and a very loose paint guide. This magazine also came with a brush and a couple of paints. And then after that, towards the back end of every magazine, you then had a little terrain build section or a little showcase. And on the back of the magazine, you could see what was coming up next. Alright, I've already primed the goblin and I'm using my trusty pliers model holder here. Really cheap and simple and effective if you don't have a model holder. Really recommend doing this. So we are going to start off and almost use a bit of a slap chop approach to this. We are going to dry brush a dark grey and then a lighter grey over the top of that. This is going to pick out all the details and give us a guide of where we're going. A big part of doing this series is I want to get better as a model painter, and this is going to encourage me to go ahead, try lots of different styles and painting techniques. I'm also trying to limit myself to about an hour per model to really get through these and get these done. There we have it with those 2 layers of dry brushes applied. The next thing we're going to do is go over all of the armour with a slightly thinned down Grim Black Speed Paint from the Army Painter. This is just going to bring all the tone in that armour down. We're going to be putting a silver dry brush over the top of this. But before we do, we're going to add a few splotches of Reikland Flesh Shade on various parts of the armour, just to give it a darky, rusty undertone as we dry brush over the top of it. Okay, we are coming in with Lead Belcher and we're using quite a flat panel, small brush, being really careful, mainly going in one direction just to pick up all of the edges of the armour. And there we have it, we have got a really nice, effective, simple, worn armour look. Next we're going to be moving on to the flesh, and of course we're going to be using Goblin Green for this. So I thinned this down on the wet palette and I went over and applied 2 thin coats. Because we've got that dry brush underneath, it is already picking out the highlights and creating the shadows in the recesses for me. So what I'm doing is I'm just going back over and applying a bit of colour to that existing tonal range, and that way then, as that dries, it creates a lovely variation in the skin. Next I picked up some yellow and really carefully applied this into the centre of each eye. And then from there was very careful and applied 2 little dots in the centre to make pupils. Unfortunately the camera didn't focus in this instance, but as you can see they're both looking in the same direction, which will not be the case for Frodo. Next I'm coming in with Dubai Brown from Scale Colour. I've just started using this brand of paint and I really like them. Now, within the Lord of the Rings series, there is a lot of brown. So we're going to need to try and separate this out so we've got a visually really differentiating tonal colours of all the leather that we've got. Otherwise, it's all going to blend into one brown blob. So you will see here, I'm going to experiment quite a lot with different browns in different places just to find out what works. So we've started off with Dubai Brown. We've gone over some of the leather sections. Next, we're coming in with a Nuln Oil just to add some depth and shade into that colour and to bring the whole range down a little bit. I then mixed a little bit of Nuln Oil into the Dubai Brown itself, applied it to the bow just to create a nice slightly darker wood colour. Now that that is done, we're going to highlight all of the leather, and we're coming over here with Barbarian Flesh, just in a really light dry brush, picking out all the edges, and this is going to give that nice worn leather look, those bright patches that you get when something's really been rubbing away or has creased multiple times all over time. And there we have it, the goblin is done. I was never able to paint like this as a kid. It's still not amazing, as I say, this is all about learning and getting better as a painter and getting models done in a short amount of time. So the magazines are going to be a loose guide for me, just to do my own thing on top of. Up next is Magazine 2, and we're moving into the ones that I have physical copies of here, so please feel free to pause on any page should I go a little bit too fast and you want to read along. So this is following the same structure as they all will. We're starting off with a bit of a guide to Middle-earth here. This magazine focuses around the alliance of men and the elves from the start of that famous scene where Isildur cuts the fingers off Sauron, takes the ring, and then doesn't destroy it like the man that he is. Then moving on from there, we're going back into learning how to play the game as well. So this is building upon the foundation of the knowledge that we got in the first episode there. Now, I didn't know how to play this game, and I still don't fully, really. But the way that this teaches you and the pace that it does is actually really friendly. It builds on concepts, so you learn something in the last episode, then they build upon it, you don't feel overwhelmed. The only downside, I guess, is that you would have to wait fortnightly to expand your knowledge and learn more about playing the game. We've got here the guide on how to paint the men and the elves that came in this magazine, so we're going to be getting on with those next. And it also had a loose overview then, the sort of tools and materials that are useful for you to be having in your hobbying world, and generally just getting you exposed to the type of things that you want to be buying and looking out for. Okie doke, starting off then with the high up. I've gone ahead, as you can see, and I've already primed this black. And much like the goblin, we're going to start off the same way. We're going to be building up a dark and then a light dry brush. Starting off with that slap chop technique. With that completed, we can see where the high points are, we can see where the low points are. It's a really great base to work from. First thing we're going to paint is all the blue on the model, and I got these from the Scale 75 Silver Non-Metallic paint range. Really great colours. I can't paint non-metallic metal, but I'm trying. So what we're starting off here is with a dark blue. We are thinning this down, applying 2 thin coats. That's giving us a nice base to work from. I'm going to be practicing a bit of layering here. Next, we're coming in with our mid-tone. We're going to leave the recesses alone and just capture more of a wider range of where the highlights would fall, following pretty much where the highlights have been created by the dry brushing underneath. This is why it's a really great technique just to figure out where to place highlights quickly. Then with the middle layer done, we're coming back over with Bearing Blue. This is a really nice light icy type of blue. Thinning this down, putting it just on the very, very tips, very raised edges of all the fabric, just to give it that final highlight. In some instances, only where the light is going to capture it, just to keep those nice darker points that we've created. Alright, there we have it. With that highlight dry, the blue is complete. Next, we're going to be moving on to the green sash that is on it. Now, the magazine paints this white, but that is just a limitation of the colours that you were given at that moment in time. I'm pretty sure that these are a range of green. I'm colourblind, so excuse me for getting any of these colours wrong as I'm watching this back. Once we've applied a dark green, we then come in and mix a bit of goblin green with that, and much like the cape, start layering up to create a nice tonal range within that green. Next, we're going to be mixing a bit of Barbarian Flesh in with our previous mixture. This is just to get the final highlight and to knock that colour back a little bit, just so it's not too vibrant of a green. It looks quite intense as this comes on, but it's very thin and I've let it dry down, and when you see the final result, it's a lot more muted and the range of colour is a lot more natural within that fabric. Next up is a second leather experiment. I'm going to be starting off with Army Painter's Oak Brown, going over all the leather parts that I think is on this model. So that's the gloves, the fan braces, the boots. I think I also applied this to the bow and the arrows in the quiver and the quiver itself. I want to experiment with this with highlighting without using a wash, so I moved on to Beastie Brown, thinned that down, and I just started building up in a couple of layers in all the areas where light would hit or things would be worn, just to create a really nice highlight. Now that we've finished painting all the parts around the armour, we can paint the armour itself. We're starting off here with a thinned down layer of Balthazar gold. I'm going to be moving on and painting Gehenna's gold over this to get that nice shiny gold that you see the High Elves with. I find if you try and apply Gehenna's gold sort of straight away without some kind of metallic undertone, it either takes loads of layers or just under certain lights you just see thin patches and it doesn't quite look right. So I applied Balthazar bronze to all of the areas that I want to be painted gold. When that was done, I came back with Gehenna's gold. You'll see that this gives a nice good base coat so that it goes on, it's got a nice backing to it. It also creates a tonal range within the gold itself, so in the shadows it helps create that nice darkness and variation that you see within gold metal. Although I didn't use a wash for the leather, I am going to be using it here for the gold. I want to experiment using a sepia wash, really trying to concentrate this into all of the nooks and crannies because it's a beautiful, intricate armor set to create that nice dark recesses within there, add to that Balthazar bronze that we've put on as a base layer. When that is dried, we're coming back over it again with Gehenna's gold and just picking out all of the areas where light would hit. So edge highlighting all of the armor panels itself, those layers, coming back in on the top of the helmet and the front face of it as well. Just applying a little bright bit of gold to add that highlight back in that we lost when the wash went over. With the armour painted, next is the strap of the quiver, and for this I'm going to be using Army Painter's Leather Brown. You can see it's just going across the shoulder to the underarm there. So really carefully I followed the line of this. Thankfully it's recessed so it captured the brush nicely, and a couple of thin coats built up that colour really well. Then on top of that I came back in, this time with the Reikland's Flesh Shade. I have a bit of Nuln Oil on the previous goblin there. This time I'm trying Reikland's Flesh Shade just to see how that creates a tonal range, and I was quite happy with the way that it turned out. Next, we're going to need to pick out the chainmail undershirt that the High Elves are wearing, and for that I am using Army Painter's Plate Metal. I am putting it onto a wet palette, but I'm not trying to thin it down too much at all. I also don't want too much on the brush for this. I am just really lightly rubbing the brush over the chainmail itself just to pick out all the ringlets, and then once that was done I also did it to the top and bottom of the bow as well. Now I thought I did, I also came back and I applied some oak brown to the bow. I know we started this as a leather based tone, but we built that up with a leather brown, so that's sort of a different shade now. Coming back in with the leather brown, that adds, I think, it's a much better wood tone than the previous one I used on the goblin bow. So we've also got the fletchings on the arrows themselves, and for that I'm going to be dry brushing them with Vallejo white. This is a really nice white, quite dry as well, a little bit chalky, so it is good for a dry brush. You just got to be careful not to splatter it over everywhere and really control it on your brush. But this came out quite well, a simple little dry brush that picked them all out really effectively, and the detail within these little fletchings is quite satisfying once you get them all individually picked out. Now, flesh tones and faces in general are not a strength of mine, so this is going to be a great series to learn this skill. So, in this instance, I'm going to start off using Bugman's Glow. I'm applying a base coat of that all over the face, just to make sure there's a nice even coverage. I built this up in 2 layers, just like Mr. Rhodes tells us to. Once that was done, I then came in with a medium flesh tone, and I started just to apply little highlights to everywhere where the light would hit. It's the tip of the nose, the cheeks, the eyes, the chin, the lips, starting to really create that tonal range within the skin. Then once that was done, I came back in and I applied a little bit of a highlight over everything that I'd just done as a medium layer, and as you can see we started to pick out the features on the face. Once I was happy enough with the face, it was then time to come in and do the eyes. Now I saw a really great thing online that white eyes just look a little bit too cartoonish on a model. So mix in a little bit of a bone white colour with that. Still try and keep it, bright, but it's not that cartoon pop. It makes it look a lot more natural on the model, so I mixed those two together. And as you can see, that's it blends in a bit better, but still really separates those eyes from the rest of the skin. Now I tried to do the pupils on this. The left one went in quite well, the right one not so much. But I didn't really come back in and fix that. As I say, this is all about learning, spending an hour on each model, getting it done, and moving it on. Now with the eyes done, our High Elf is complete. Now, the amount of layering that was involved with this paint job, it was intricate, but I reckon if you were to batch process this, you could probably get quite a lot of these done in quite a short amount of time. Which is just as fortunate because we're going to be doing more on this Man of Gondor. Again, we've gone ahead, we've reprimed him, he's in the trusty pliers, so let's go ahead and start. Now, because the cloth on this is black, we're going to leave that as the base tone, and we're going to be building up the highlights using various shades of grey. So I mixed black and white on the wet palette, created a nice dark grey, really thinned this down, and started applying it in a wide area over all of those highlights that we can see. I didn't go ahead and I didn't do a dry brush on this model because that would just ruin all of the dark tones that we want to retain within the fabric. So once the first dark couple of layers were applied of the grey, I then lightened that grey ever so slightly, and just like the cloak of the High Elf, we are reducing the area that we're painting each time that the colour is getting brighter that we are mixing. This is narrowing our highlight down then from a nice wide dark range in all of the recesses up to that nice bright highlight on the very tips. Now you'll tend to see that if you look at black in real life, that it does actually have some quite sharp grey to white highlights on it, so don't necessarily be too worried about going super bright in some areas, but don't overdo it. You still want to keep a nice dark subtleness all over the fabric. Now we're going to be moving on and painting the trim. We are going to be using a sea grey, mixing that with a little bit of Abaddon black just to make a nice dark grey. I don't want to use the really thin down stuff that I did earlier. That's not going to be a decent enough coverage. So I'm going all over the trim at the front of the tunic, as well as the tree symbol there on the chest piece. And once that has been applied, I then add a little lighter grey. I believe this is a Stonewall grey, and I'm coming out and I'm just picking out all the little areas, the corners, the highlights, the edges, anywhere that's going to capture just a little bit more light than the rest of the areas would naturally do. That was quite fiddly getting all the little edge highlights in, but it was worth taking my time and doing. Batch process painting this, I probably wouldn't have gone to this length. Alright, with that done, we're going to be going back and using the oak brown again for the leather. I really like the way that this turned out on the High Elf, so I'm going to try and replicate this now. As well as using it as a base, there is sort of a bone linen-y light brown underneath the grey tunic, so we're going to be using the oak brown as the basis for that. For the highlight to the oak brown, we're coming in with leather brown, just like on the High Elf, and picking out all of the sort of the knuckles, all of the fingers and the little highlights there on the back of the calves, all the creases on the boots, giving that extra little bit of vibrance into that brown. With that highlighted, we now need to do that under tunic to create that bony linen colour. So I am coming in and I'm mixing barbarian flesh with the leather brown that we have previously done, thinning that down a bit, and just like we've highlighted on the previous fabric, we're doing a wide range first, creating our middle tone. I'm also doing it on the vambraces as well, on the models I looked at, those bits with the linen colour too. And then gradually move that from the mixed bone, barbarian flesh and leather brown up to just a solid barbarian flesh. Not much left to paint, so let's get all of the armour done. We are using Army Painter's plate metal. I really like this colour for just a nice bright medium range silver. It really pops. So we're popping that on the helmets, the vambraces, the shin guards, the sword, anything that we want to be silver. Like the High Elf, I'm going to be experimenting with using a wash now for the armour. So for this, we're going to be using a Nuln Oil. We don't want to be using Reikland Flesh Shade or a sepia tone. That's going to create too much of a rusty look in this. So we're using the Nuln Oil. The other benefit about using plate metal is that when you put Nuln Oil over the top of it, it still retains quite a lot of its shine underneath. So it really does make it look like some nice battle-worn armour. Now, these Men of Gondor, or Men of Numenor, however you want to call them, they're Men of Gondor in this magazine, they have a gold trim around the front of the helmet and the little wings that go up and the cheek protective pieces, as well as a gold hilt and, is it pummel to the sword? Yeah, I believe it's pummel. So we just went around and picked those out using Gehenna's gold. Just like the armour on the High Elf, then I came back in and we just picked out any edge highlights with the silver tone just to put that light back in on all the top points. Next we're going to be moving on to painting the face, and I'm going to be doing this in a different method now to the one that I did with the High Elf. I am coming in with Barbarian Flesh and making sure that we get a good base coverage down, leaving a little black all around the edge for a shadow. I'm then applying a flesh wash all over the top of this, thin down to start off with, and then I put a second one on top that was slightly thicker as I needed a bit more range in the skin. I then put a little bit of Barbarian Flesh back over the top to pick out all the brightness. So moving on, we are going to be using Bone White, and we're going to be using that for the teeth. Just like the eyes, we don't really want to be using a straight white. It's a little bit too cartoonish, stands out too much from the rest of the model. So that nice muted off-tone white is perfect for this. Next up is the shield. This is really simple. We're going back to our trusty plate metal, not worrying too much if we make a mistake like I do here, and we're going to be capturing all of these details out now in the plate metal. As I say, it doesn't matter too much if you get it on the black. We can come back in and touch that up afterwards. Obviously, try within the center of this not to go too crazy and really splotch it, but you could always pick that detail back out with a Nuln Oil wash. The stars we paint in Gehenna's gold, they're really simple, just a little squiggle on top to pick up all those pointy areas of detail. With that now applied, we can come back in and fix all the little mistakes that we've done with a bit of touch-up black. And then I grab some Nuln Oil and start putting this all over the silver area that we've created. Not too thick, something that is just going to run into all the recesses and again add a little bit of tonal range to that metal. So with that done, it is time to pop the shield on. And there we have it, we have our Man of Numenor or Man of Gondor complete also. Now that was a complete lie because I haven't painted the hair. So I want a brown hair on this guy, so we're starting off with oak brown as we have done before, getting a really nice even coverage all over that. Coming in then with a little bit of Nuln Oil just to add some depth into that brown that we've created. I don't want it too bright. And then when that's done, I'm mixing in a little bit of Stonewall Grey in with that brown itself. And what we're going to be doing then with this nice browny grey, picking out all of those fine strands and putting a nice little highlight over all those little strands of hair. With the hair complete, I'm no longer lying to you, now we are finished with this Man of Gondor. Next up, in Magazine 3, we are taking a look at Frodo. Specifically, this goes over more rules and priority moving within the game, as well as a scenario including Aragorn, Frodo, and the Ringwraiths. We get an introduction to the Ringwraiths, a little bit about who they are, again about who Frodo is and who Aragorn is. As we're going through, we're seeing that we're building up now again on our knowledge from the previous magazines about how to play the game. We've also got a lovely little diorama there. I remember spending so long just staring at that as a kid, thinking how much I want it. Maybe we'll create something crazy enough by the end of this to fulfill my childhood dreams. So as you can see there, we're taking a look a little bit more in depth of the game there. And we have our guide on how to paint Frodo. So we're going to be loosely following this, just like the previous magazines, but also putting our spin on top of it. This time around, the terrain that we're making is a simple hedgerow. These builds start off really simple and easy and accessible, and then by the end of it, it assumes that you've got half a craft warehouse out the back, just ready to pull out of your arse at any moment to build half of Minas Tirith. We've got Mr. Frodo locked into the pliers and we're ready to get started. This is going to be a difficult little model because he's really small. So we're going to start off with Oak Brown. We're going to be putting this over all of the sections that we want to be brown. Now in the magazine it tells you to mix red and brown to create the reddy brown of his tunic and trousers. But what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be starting off, all the leather areas are going to be oak brown. I'm then going to be coming in now and mixing that oak brown in with some Vallejo Bloody Red. Starting off with just a subtle mix at the moment, sort of like a 70% oak brown, 30% red, and then we're going to be building up in a couple of layers that intensity, putting thin coats on, creating that nice tonal range throughout that red leather. Not red leather, red fabric. For the bits that we've left oak brown, we're going to be highlighting these with Beastie Brown. Thinning this down ever so slightly, building it up in layers, applying it to where all the highlights where the light is going to catch. A couple of edge highlights there, we're going around the cuffs, we're going around the backpack, the inside of the coat, and that's really built itself up and it's looking good. Just like we did with the goblin at the start of this video, we're going to be going over now the backpack with a light dry brush of barbarian flesh, just to pick out all the edges of it, give it that nice, really worn down look. Now, due to my colour blindness, I had to ask my girlfriend what colour the cape was that Frodo was wearing in sort of this version of him, of the model. And it was a bluey green is what she came back to me with, so I decided to mix this myself, sort of colour matching it the best that my eyes possibly could. And what I was doing here is putting a base colour on, and again, layering up, we're just applying more light colour, lighter blue, into the mixed dark green, bluey green that we created, just to get those nice highlights all over the cape. There's not much left to paint of him now, so let's move on and do the skin. Now I'm going to be replicating the same method that I did for the Man of Gondor in the previous paint job. I really like the way that this, it just went down, it was really simple with the flesh wash, came out with a great look. It was really easy then to add the highlights back in, just to create a bit of extra range and depth within the face. So that's what I'm going to be doing again here, coming back in with this Vallejo flesh wash. Applying that, I think it was more or less straight out of the bottle this time. I think I just did dab a tiny bit of water with it just to help it flow. But not as thin as I did last time, learned from that mistake and got a good coverage, really creating that little face of Frodo there. Unfortunately this didn't focus, but he's got some silver buttons on his tunic, as well as there's also a button on the cuff, and he's also holding the ring so the chain there is out. So all of those got a nice little brushing with plate mail, the same as his sword, capturing the hilt and the pommel as well. With the wash on his face now dry, I could come back in and just pick out all his cheeks, the top of his nose, his brow, jawline there, and just give that a nice little highlight to create that further range. Also pick out his fingers and knuckles. Next up, we're back to the non-oil. We just want to knock some of that brightness out of the plate mail that we put on the sword, create a few shadows, make it look a little bit more worn and used. So we went over this, it's pretty much straight out of the bottle, no need to thin this down, and then once that was dried, came back in over the top and applied a slight little highlight back. So now it was my time to try and do Frodo's eyes. We're using the slight off-white that we made last time, getting in the center there the best that I could, and then I did this off camera to make it a bit more stable. He's slightly cross-eyed, but there we have it. Frodo can now see his way to Mordor. For Frodo's hair now, I came in and gave a light dry brush of the oak brown. I then lightened that ever so slightly with a bit of barbarian flesh, went over that a second time just to create a further highlight there. A hobbit just isn't a hobbit unless it has hairy feet, so we also come over the top of Frodo's feet and just apply some of our hair tone there as well. With his hair complete, that is it. We now have one complete Mr. Frodo. time now to get stuck into magazines 4 and 5. 4 introduced you to the Uruk-hai, 5 gave you Lurtz, so I'm going to paint these both at the same time because they're both Uruk-hai, they're going to be the similar principles. So we're starting off in magazine 4 with an introduction to who the Uruk-hai are. Next up, we're expanding now on our knowledge of how to play the game with the fighting phase. You've got the wound table there. I suggest if you don't know how the Middle-earth game plays that you study that and try and figure out how that works, because there's some really interesting things you can do with characters making crazy saves against insane attacks. The scenario that we're going through in this magazine is a fairly basic one. It's using the Men of Gondor, the Elves and the Uruk-hai that you've just been given to have a good little open battle on a table of your choosing. Okay, so the bit that we're really interested in now is how we paint the Uruk-hai warriors and how they do it. So again, we're taking a look at how we trim and clean up the model. It introduces us to making dark metal and dry brushing, edge highlighting, painting flesh, and finally we've got a nice build of a simple hill using a bit of polystyrene, and I'll show you later on in a further magazine. They've got a hot wire cutter. It's not used here, but it is the craziest jank that you've seen. So next we are on to Lurtz. Starting off then, we've got our introduction into Lurtz himself and his ultimate demise by the Sword of Aragorn. Moving on then, expanding on our knowledge of the game, we're taking a more in-depth look at the shooting phase itself and the different profiles that characters have throughout the game. We've also got a repeat there of the wound chart, as I say last time. Take a look into that, that thing is crazy. Moving on, we're playing out scenario. Frodo and Aragorn are being hunted by the Uruk-hai and they've got to get away. What I like about this as well is that as they go through it, they tell you the outcome of their game as well. Next up, we've got our guide on how to paint Lurtz. That's building upon the previous episode where we're painting that Uruk-hai as well. So we're going to be using a lot of the techniques across the two models here. And finally, this is how you set up a basic game. I'm really looking forward to actually filming some tabletop content. I've got a really large battle mat, and yeah, that's going to be coming up soon. So let's move on and start painting these Uruk-hai then. What we're going to do is a slight bit of a reverse slap chop. We're going to be starting off by dry brushing everything with a lead belcher. Because of there's so much armor on these models, it makes sense to try and get all of that done first, and then we can block in everything else afterwards. And it doesn't take us long before we've got our good base coat down and a nice edge highlight over all that arm panel. So now we're going to go on and add a little bit of shade and weathering to this. For this I'm going to mix Nuln Oil and Sepia Shade. This is going to give me a nice sort of dark, rusty, dirty undertone to the armour, without making it look a little bit too like it doesn't fit in the realm of Mordor. So all we do is we just slap this all over. We're not being too careful. We want to really cover everything in a good layer of this. And then we just set it off to one side and let it dry. Once dry, we can see there's a lot more tonal range within that now. There's a bit of brown that's picking out, and that's going to look really nice now when we come back and apply a second little highlight of plate metal, being really careful, just dry brushing this over all of the edges, just to bring that extra little bit of shine back into the model. Next up, we can now start painting the leather on both of these models. So I'm going to be using my recipe now, starting off with oak brown, getting all over the belts, the loincloth. Lurtz has got sort of a lot of leather all over his armor as well. Controversial, let me know your opinion. I did paint two of the straps on his chest piece, as you can see there. In the official image, it looks like they're made out of leather, but I've seen a lot of people paint that metal. Let me know which one you've decided to go for. So once that's been done, we then just come over and Nuln Oil all of this. I really want a nice dark, weathered, these are Uruk-hai after all. These are not going to be clean clothes. These are going to be absolutely battered and abused. So get a nice, really dark, rich color into that. Once that's been done, I then come back in and I'm using the oak brown again just to bring that highlight back over all the edges where the light would capture that we've just lost from putting the Nuln Oil shade all over the top. Moving on next, it was time to get the skin done. So I'm starting again with the yolk brown, but this time I've added some black to it as well as a dark red. I'm going over and just getting a good even coat over all the skin, every little bit of exposed area. What I'm going to be doing then is adding a slightly bit more brighter brown, brighter red into that mix and building up in layers. In the magazine it tells you to paint a reddy browny mix. I don't actually have any decent reddy brown sort of paints that would work for Uruk-hai skin, so I think I'm going to have to invest in buy something to save me from mixing this every time I have to paint Uruk-hai. But this was a matter of just thinning that paint down now as we're getting it lighter, getting it on all the raised areas of skin, picking out things like the fingers, the calves there, anywhere that's going to catch a little bit more light. There we are, we've now got that dried. So these models look a little bit more glossy than they do. You'll see a little showcase towards the end. Just due to the intensity and the closeness that I have the lights, it is giving it an extra shine that you won't see if you saw the model in front of you. Right, next up we need to get Lurtz's nice teeth all painted. This is just being really careful with a nice sharp Artus Opus brush, picking out all those little details there. Next thing to do then was to get the eyes done. I did these off camera just so I could brace my hand. I think I used the Luminous Green from AK Interactive to do this, and it was just a simple matter of obviously being really careful and making sure I just dot straight in the center of those eyes. Lurtz's hair is what we're going to be tackling next, so first I need to block this out with a Abaddon black just to get rid of all those silver dry brushes that we put on earlier. Then I'm going to be coming in with a medium sea grey, thinning that down and applying edge highlights onto all the strands that I can, just using the side of the brush to capture just as many as I can, really focusing towards the top end where the light would hit the model. Doesn't matter if you capture all of them. What I'm going to do after this now is come back in and apply a Nuln Oil wash all over the top of that. What that is going to do is unify all of those colours, knock that brightness down a little bit, and you'll see now when it dries, it just makes it look a lot more natural. Hair complete, the next thing we can focus on now is getting his bow painted. We're starting off with Dubai Brown. I'm applying a good 2 thin coats all over that. Once that's done and dried, we're then coming back over it with a Nuln Oil wash. This is just to darken it down ever so slightly. And then once that's dried, we're coming back in again with the Dubai Brown and adding an edge highlight to that bow. Next we need to pick out all the fletchings on the arrows in his quiver, and we're going to be doing the same technique that we did with the elf earlier on. We're going to be getting some nice Vallejo white, knocking a lot of that off the dry brush and just really carefully going over it, not pressing hard at all, just letting the brush find all of those raised areas and really nicely picking out all that detail. And whilst we got the white out, I came in and also applied the nice white hand of Saruman. And there we have it, we have finished painting our models that have come with the first 5 magazines. Next up that we need to do now is base them all. We're starting off with a really simple mix of PVA glue and a bit of water just to thin it down. I ended up adding a little bit more PVA glue, I put a bit too much water in with this. So as you can see there, I added enough PVA glue I needed just to get sort of like a thick milky consistency. For my ground texture, I'm going to be using a very fine model sand, as well as some Army Painter. These are really cool, nice little battleground rocks. They look amazing when you mix them in with this sand. So we're just putting these two in a nice empty goo pot. This is giving us our mix. We're then coming in, brushing the PVA glue all over the base of the model. You know how to base. We're getting it nice and saturated. Once we've got that base covered in the PVA glue, we're going to put a nice sprinkle of that mixture that we've just made. We want to tap off any loose bits and then run your finger around the edge so you get a nice clean base. I gave all of those a good blast with a hairdryer to dry them off quicker, and next we're going to now base coat these. We're starting off with a surface primer from Vallejo. This is just a nice black which I use through the airbrush. We're mixing that with a little bit of water and then making sure to really dab that into all of the texture base that we've got, really giving it a good coating. From there we're moving on to medium sea grey. We're going to be applying a dry brush of this now all over it just to pick out that nice detail. This is going to be the first stage of us layering in a few ground colours, some greys, some browns, some greens, just to get a nice tonal range within there. Once that's been done, I'm now coming in now with Raw Umber. This is a craft paint. I tend to try and use craft paints when I'm painting bases, only because I don't want to waste my nice expensive ones on stuff that you really sort of end up abusing and putting a whole bunch of washes and layers on. So from there, I'm just putting this Raw Umber wash all over the grey that we've already put down. Once that's dried, we're coming back over the top with an exceptionally thin dusting then, a medium sea grey all over the top. We just want to put some very fine highlights back in, and this is ready for our next stage where we're going to be coming over this again with Goblin Green. This is just going to help give us a nice couple of high points, a couple of low points, and blend all of this in then with the brown that we created. Hopefully get a nice earthy looking tone, sort of a nice edge of a field, start of a forest type of vibe. Next, we're going to start building up our foliage now, starting off with these green grass tufts. These are in various different shades, and a lot of them are far too big in correlation to these models. I need to trim down. You'll see I put one on Frodo. I need to come back in and actually knock that down a little bit. I think it's a bit too big in relation to him, as you'll see here in a moment. But what I do is I put these down first. We're going to apply a flocking then over the bottom of this, but I find if you put the flocking down first and then you try and put these grass tufts on, there's just not enough surface area for things to stick to. So I like to stick these down first as last, just straight to the actual texture that we've created on the base, and then we're going to come back in a moment with some PVA glue and add some further flocking. To make our flocking mix, I'm starting off with a very fine grass tuft, and what I'm going to be adding to that is I picked up some of this, it's like a clump moss foliage. I believe it's designed to go in sort of internal plant pots, just to make them all look all nice. I'm clumping that up and I'm taking my scissors to it, mixing all that then in within the grass tufts to get a nice range of colour in what's going to go down on these bases. So we're coming back with our watered down PVA glue, and this time we're just going all over the base again, being careful not to get it on any part of the model. we don't want grass growing on the back of anybody's capes here. So we are just sprinkling this on like we did with the sand texture, knocking off any excess, cleaning up that rim, and now we've got a lovely flock on that base. These are all going to blend perfectly in with a nice meadow themed battle mat that I've got to play these games on. And for the final touch, we're going to paint all of these base rims now with a Gobi brown. Thinning this down, applying it in as many coats as is needed to get a nice thin, even coverage, so all of those bases look nice and crisp. And here we have it, all of our models are now finished. You have to excuse me, I do not have an automated rotary table, so this is just me with my finger trying to edit all the footage together. So as you can see, I've placed next to each model there how the outcome was in the magazine. Hopefully I surpassed some of the paint jobs in the magazine. Some of them are actually really good as they get later on, so I'm looking forward to diving into those. Let me know what you thought of the form of this video. Do you want more focus on painting, more focus on the magazines? This is obviously a new endeavour. We've got a lot of these to get through, so I'm sure we'll find a set format as we go. Next up, we're going to be coming back and doing the Warlord Titan. Obviously, that is now ready for painting. I've nearly got everything printed off that we need to, just to make sure that it's all wrapped up. We're going to be doing a couple of little pieces on the base as well, just to embellish that a little bit more. So that's what's going to be coming up next. If you are new here, thanks ever so much for sticking around. And if you're still watching this far in, why don't you give me a subscribe? If you're not already, please like this video. And as always, I'll catch you again next time. Bye for now.